In my last two videos, I gave my answer to 2 of 3 questions Nick Redding asked in his video on anti-fem praxis. What is feminism, and where do non-feminist people stand? I had to answer the first 2 partly because some of the answer to the third question rests on the groundwork laid by answering those 2. I established that feminism is a scam, and I established that non-feminist people are up against not only feminism itself, but a human instinct, which is the reason that that scam was so successful. Yet, we are in a far better position now specifically because of the visibility of the men's movement than we were before it was well known. So here I am at the question, what is to be done? Considering it raised some other questions. What is the actual problem? What is right? And what goals should we have if we are a movement and not just a group that shares a label for an outlook? Now, given that we're discussing feminism and non-feminism, why would I be asking, what is the actual problem? For that, we have to look at how and why feminist agitation affects people. By agitation, I'm referring to lobbying, protests, information campaigns, anything they do to create change in the legal and social landscape. The first answer is that it leads to gender imbalance in adult obligation, accountability, rights, and restrictions, one which has damaging impact on the welfare of individuals of both sexes. The second is a bit more complex, and it explains why the answer to what is to be done is not entirely simple, even though there are simple forms of activism in which we can all engage. We know that part of the reason feminist agitation results in dramatic legal and social change is society's protective attitude toward women. Regardless of whether we're talking about the most prestigious leaders or the average citizen, people are more willing to compromise legal protection of personal rights and freedoms or put legal obligations and restrictions in place when those changes are purported to be for women's benefit. This is demonstrated by more than a century of legal and social change, which has taken place specifically in response to the assertion that women have been oppressed. I already touched on that in my previous video when I went over the role of gynocentrism in determining where anti-feminists stand. I don't believe that we're in a position to entirely eliminate gynocentrism, seeing that it is instinctive to a degree. I do believe we're in a position where we can draw attention to the harm that is done to adults and children of both sexes when gynocentrism is allowed to play a dysfunctional role in the legal system. But what role is that? Well, it's the sales tactic used to promote authoritarian social micromanagement. This is not to say that all law is bad. For human beings to live in close proximity with each other, without chaotic violence as a result, we have to have a balance between certain aspects of our existence. These are the individual's personal liberty and personal boundaries, the liberty and boundaries of his neighbors, and the ability of the population within a community to manage risks and needs which occur specifically because of our choice to live as a community. There are some risks and needs which can be more effectively and productively managed through collaboration within the community rather than by the individual, such as creating and maintaining a system for public transit. So we have laws which define the limits of each of these factors. Your freedom of choice, for instance, does not include the right to violate another person's bodily autonomy. There's good reason for that personal boundary to take precedence over the right to freedom of choice, at least if you don't want to live in a violent society. In other words, my rights end where your nose begins. We also have government to administer a system to handle those risks and needs which a community is going to manage collectively rather than individually. One of those needs is a consistent measure and consistent enforcement of the boundary between one community member's rights and another community member's nose. The problem begins when the community cannot agree on the role of its governing body, the boundaries between the individual and the need for that government's interference, and the things which are included on the list of factors which should be managed more by government authority than individual choice. At one end of the spectrum of beliefs regarding functional government, the individual is viewed as the main arbiter of his own welfare and interests. The boundary between the individual and government interference is set so as to leave the maximum possible amount of individual liberty intact. The governing body is intended as a tool for the community. The idea at that end is to limit government interference in individual lives to what is necessary for maintaining an infrastructure to facilitate freedom of movement and trade of resources, to protect the community's members against violations of their autonomy and liberty, including by other members, and to respond to threats to the safety of the community such as a disaster or an outside attack. The larger the community, the less sense it makes for a government to take a role in the individual's everyday life choices where those choices do not have a direct violating impact on others. Libertarianism, or classical liberalism, is a philosophy advocating only minimal state intervention in the lives of citizens. At the other end, the authoritarian end of it, the government is viewed as the main arbiter of everyone's welfare and interests, and the boundaries between individual and government interference are set where the governing body places them. The governing body is an authority over the community. The government itself uses enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to said authority at the expense of personal freedom to whatever degree the governing body sees fit. This often includes social engineering, the use of centralized planning in an attempt to manage social change and regulate the future development and behavior of a society. Authoritarian social micromanagement is the ever-increasing use of government power for extreme social engineering at an extreme expense of individual liberty, in which the governing body closely observes and controls the lives of community members under the guise of judicious, magnanimous protection. In other words, exactly the same excuse John C. Calhoun used when trying to justify slavery in a speech to the Senate on February 6, 1837, when he said, quote, "I may say with truth that in few countries so much is left to the share of the laborer, and so little extracted from him, or where there is more kind attention paid to him in sickness or infirmities of age. Compare his condition with the tenants of poorhouses in the more civilized portions of Europe. Look at the sick and the old and infirm slave, on one hand, in the midst of his family and friends, under the kind, supervising care of his master and mistress, and compare it with the forlorn and wretched condition of the pauper in the poorhouse." End quote. How condescending that was, and we can see it today for what it was. By virtue of seeing themselves as superior, these authoritarian jackasses convinced themselves that enslaving people they considered inferior was not a human rights violation. It is my belief that the problem is not that flawed beliefs, even those as flawed as Calhoun's superiority complex or feminism's victim narrative, are allowed to exist and be articulated. It is not the fact that society has a protective attitude toward women or any other group, but that we haven't eliminated the ease with which ideas lead to acceptance of authoritarian social micromanagement. That, in a nutshell, is the general answer to the question, what is the actual problem? A more specific answer is that, due to its having been achieved through the use of feminism's victim narrative to exploit the natural gynocentric human instinct, this acceptance has left us with not only an oppressive authoritarian system, but one which employs a terribly imbalanced legal system. That system defines the concept of a human right differently depending on which humans are under consideration and implements accountability, restriction, and obligation differently depending on which citizens are being held accountable, restricted, or put under obligation. That imbalance results in systematic injustice against those who receive less consideration for human rights protections and who are treated as more accountable, placed under more restriction, and are more obligated to provide for others' welfare. In light of that, my answer to what is right is fairly simple. If something is a human right, that means all humans, not one sex over the other, not one nationality, nor any other group identity, but all humans. And the same goes for accountability, restriction, and obligation. Being of a particular group identity must not be considered an exemption. It must not be considered a reason why somebody must be more accountable, further restricted, or placed under heavier obligation. This simplifies also the answer to what goals a non-feminist movement should have. That is, again, if we are to be called a movement, and non-feminist is not just a label for an outlook. The most damaging aspect of feminism has been that the movement has influenced law and policy to become so terribly imbalanced. The most rational goal then would be to restore balance to those systems. Laws intended to protect the individual against infringements of their human rights should protect all people equally, provide equal recourse in the case of violations, and hold those laws' violators equally accountable regardless of factors like sex, race, and individual beliefs. Laws which provide a benefit or impose restrictions or obligations must not discriminate on those bases. The law should not privilege one group's interests or welfare over that of another. It should not be used for social engineering at the expense of individual liberties. The government cannot be the primary arbiter of citizens' welfare or interests. In other words, human nature would make it futile to battle feminism for the sake of eliminating it. That doesn't mean wrong assertions that come from feminists shouldn't be countered, nor does it mean the ideology and the behavior of its proponents shouldn't be criticized. They should, but the battle has to take a different direction. As long as gynocentrism exists as a prevailing social attitude, and it will as long as it remains a human instinct, authoritarian government will always lead to social engineering, and it will always lead to an imbalance in human rights considerations, accountability, restrictions, and obligations. The decision-makers who go down that road likely won't even know they're on it. If we cannot eliminate gynocentrism, and again at this point I think we cannot, then we cannot eradicate feminism, and our fight must instead be against the authoritarianism feminists use to enforce their social engineering. Libertarianism is the only way to effectively and consistently counteract the effects of gynocentrism on government systems. In a libertarian society, however, you cannot just sit back and let your government be your babysitter. It's the other way around, in fact. And that leads us to what is to be done. About time, huh? The first thing is already underway. Many of us have been raising awareness of the issues for several years, and various non-feminist movements have rallied around their understanding of the imbalance in law and policy. Some advocate reform, while others advocate or seek ways to survive the imbalance, and still others have made a practice of removing themselves from the system. The effort to raise awareness of the problem spans all of those movements, and while that effort has seen a great deal of success in the last few years, often thanks to the dedication and determination of some of the more heavily criticized leaders of various movements, it needs to continue. More, we really need to unify on the most basic of criticisms, the fact that combining feminist agitation with an authoritarian government and social engineering leads to significant discrimination in law and policy. Awareness of that imbalance needs to be spread far and wide. Feminism's role in causing and preserving it will have to be articulated only because if it's not, feminists will continue to unironically promote authoritarian application of feminist ideology as a solution to it. So what should be promoted as a solution? Diligent and vigilant citizen participation in the legislative process, and the evolution of government from an authoritarian nature to a libertarian one. It will not matter what ideology is promoted if the law does not allow for the use of anyone's belief to justify infringement of human rights or exemption from adult accountability, regardless. Legal reform must happen with a focus on taking identity specificity out of the law. Court reform must happen, also with a focus on taking identity specificity out, and with a focus on dramatically increasing transparency and other checks and balances. There are too many things decided by individual judges today that should not be imposed on citizens without a hearing with a jury. For instance, a family relationship should not be forcibly severed by the court without a jury trial, and no judge should be able to use a gag order to hide unfair treatment of any courtroom petitioner. Social reform, with a focus on genderless consideration for human rights and accountability, must also be achieved. If, as feminists claim, women are truly as capable as men, then we are as capable as men are of living up to the accountability standards they face, and we have no excuse to accept any degree of exemption. To this end, it is essential that the movement be visible. Attend events which center around non-feminist advocacy, whether it be anti-feminism, talks by free speech advocates, or men's issues events. If you can publicly support non-feminist causes, make yourself visible by doing so. This is why it is so important to support and participate in things like the International Conference on Men's Issues, held this year on the Gold Coast of Australia in June. Hope to see some of you there. The link to the info will be in the low bar. If anonymity is a necessity for you, supporting the efforts of those who can be public about it or whose activism has forced them into the spotlight is also important. Post on social media, even if you have to do so anonymously. Talk to people if you can. Make videos if you can. Live stream if you can. Write letters to the editor of your local newspaper. Put information in public places where it is legal to do so and where it will be seen. This can be done through postering, stickering, and signposting, even something like leaving printed out memes in public restrooms. Any legal way you can to get people thinking. Host postings of the Red Pill documentary. Don't be afraid to ask people involved with the movement to help with question and answer sessions after the showing. Don't be afraid to be the person answering those questions. Comment on news stories that get it wrong, and those that get it right. Network with each other. And when possible, engage in peaceful public assembly and demonstration. Host talks by people of non-feminist movements who can explain the issues and possible working solutions. Compile useful infographics and links to articles, study reports, and other information, and make them available to other non-feminists. Beyond raising awareness, however, we can do the things we advocate. Participate in the legislative process as citizens by monitoring what our legislators are doing, and by contacting them regularly to advocate for unbiased law that does not infringe on personal liberty for the sake of social engineering. We can and should step up when we see another person dealing with issues caused by legal imbalance. If you know someone who is dealing with a legal issue, go with them to their hearing, even if you're not a witness in the case. The bigger the audience they have, the less apt courtroom personnel are to exhibit corruption. Support people's initiatives intended to remedy some of the imbalances that currently exist in the system. Support the spread of information by sharing it on social media and social bookmarking sites. Archive everything. The one thing you can never stop is your vigilance, your liberty, your personal autonomy, your ability to have personal boundaries that others are not permitted to violate. These things you will have to defend as long as you live. There will always be someone waiting for you to relax your guard, rest on your laurels, and fail to notice or care when they infringe. We may not always have to fight to gain liberty or end discrimination. There should come a time when we have won those battles, but we will always have to guard against attempts to take it back. And it will always be our right and our responsibility to do exactly that. In short, the fight for justice should not involve prefacing the term with social or any other modifier, but the active defense of personal liberty and accountability. It doesn't always have to be this heated, but human nature dictates that it will probably always have to exist. Châtelet, my dudes. We're in this one for the long haul.